1337 dawned with Sultan Orhan Ghazi, now nearly 50 years old and emboldened by a decade of successive conquests that had transformed his modest inheritance into the most formidable Turkish power in Anatolia, standing on a coastal promontory gazing across the azure waters toward Nicomedia, the final major Byzantine stronghold in northwestern Anatolia, and a city whose capture would complete Ottoman domination of the entire Sea of Marmara coastline. The ancient metropolis sprawled magnificently along the Gulf of İzmit, its harbor filled with Byzantine vessels, its massive walls rising directly from the water's edge on three sides, while formidable land fortifications protected the vulnerable eastern approach, a defensive masterpiece that had served as the Eastern Roman Empire's capital before Constantine the Great shifted imperial focus to Constantinople, just across the narrow strait. Those walls had witnessed Emperor Diocletian's retirement, sheltered Constantine during his rise to power, and endured centuries of Persian, Arab, and Turkish attacks without ever falling to direct assault. Now Orhan, commanding an Ottoman state that had conquered Bursa, Nicaea, and dozens of lesser Byzantine cities through patient siege warfare and diplomatic cunning, proposed to accomplish what so many before him had failed to achieve, bringing Nicomedia under Turkish Muslim control and effectively ending 13 centuries of Roman Christian governance in Anatolia. The strategic importance of Nicomedia transcended even its considerable military and economic value, representing the symbolic completion of Byzantine expulsion from the Anatolian heartland that had sustained the empire for over a millennium. This was no peripheral fortress, but a city that had housed imperial courts, witnessed theological debates that shaped Christianity, served as the Eastern Empire's logistical hub, and maintained cultural and economic significance rivaling any Byzantine center except Constantinople itself. The city's population of perhaps 30,000 included some of Byzantium's most distinguished aristocratic families, wealthiest merchants whose commercial networks spanned the Mediterranean, and influential clergy whose ecclesiastical authority extended throughout northwestern Anatolia. Emperor Andronicos III, who had watched helplessly as Ottoman forces captured city after city over the previous decade, understood that losing Nicomedia would constitute a catastrophic blow from which Byzantine power in Asia might never recover. Unlike Bursa or Nicaea, which had fallen while imperial attention was divided by civil wars and European threats, Nicomedia's siege would test whether Byzantium could mount effective resistance when fully aware of the stakes involved. Orhan's decision to target Nicomedia in 1337 reflected both strategic calculation and recognition that the time was finally right to complete Ottoman domination of northwestern Anatolia. He had spent the years since capturing Nicaea in 1332 consolidating territorial gains, establishing administrative institutions, developing naval capabilities that could challenge Byzantine maritime dominance, and most importantly, building military forces capable of conducting simultaneous operations on land and sea, essential requirements for attacking a city protected by water on three sides. His army now numbered perhaps 20,000 warriors, including elite cavalry sipahi holding Timar estates, professional infantry receiving regular treasury payments, and auxiliary forces drawn from recently conquered territories, while his nascent navy possessed sufficient vessels to at least contest Byzantine control of the Gulf of İzmit, even if not establishing complete Ottoman supremacy. The Sultan understood that Nicomedia's formidable defenses made direct assault suicidal. But he had proven during previous sieges that patient blockade combined with naval operations to cut supply lines could reduce even the mightiest fortress to submission through economic strangulation. The Byzantine defense of Nicomedia rested under the capable leadership of a governor whose name the chronicles preserve as Constantine, a veteran military commander who had observed the fall of numerous Anatolian cities to Ottoman forces and was grimly determined that Nicomedia would not join that ignominious list. The garrison under his command numbered approximately 4,000 professional soldiers, supplemented by several thousand armed citizens and sailors from the naval vessels based in Nicomedia's harbor. Adequate forces to defend the extensive fortifications if supplies held and naval reinforcement remained possible. Constantine understood that his true strategic advantage lay not in defeating Ottoman forces militarily, which his relatively small garrison could never accomplish in open battle, but in maintaining the city's defenses while Byzantine naval superiority kept supply lines open until either Orhan's patience exhausted itself or external threats compelled the Ottomans to abandon the siege. Medieval siege warfare was fundamentally a test of endurance and logistics, and Nicomedia's access to the sea provided crucial advantages that landlocked cities like Bursa and Nicaea had lacked. The opening moves of the campaign in spring 1337 revealed Orhan applying lessons learned from a decade of siege operations while adapting to Nicomedia's unique geographic circumstances that made it the most challenging target he had yet attempted. Ottoman forces established positions surrounding the city's eastern land approaches, constructing fortified camps and siege lines that would prevent any relief forces from reaching Nicomedia overland or any defenders from launching surprise sorties. Simultaneously, Orhan deployed his fleet, now numbering perhaps 40 vessels. Modest by Byzantine standards but representing extraordinary achievement for a power that possessed virtually no naval capabilities just 6 years earlier, to blockade the Gulf of Midson and interdict Byzantine supply convoys. The initial naval engagements proved indecisive, with Byzantine warships demonstrating superior seamanship and tactical skill, but finding themselves unable to completely break the Ottoman blockade given the Turks' numerical presence and growing maritime competence. This stalemate at sea meant Nicomedia could still receive some supplies, but not the abundant provisions that would allow indefinite resistance, creating strategic ambiguity about whether the siege would succeed to starvation or fail due to inadequate Ottoman naval dominance. The psychological warfare both sides conducted during the campaign's opening phase demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how siege success depended as much on morale and perception as on military operations. Orhan sent messages to Nicomedia offering his now standard generous surrender terms: garrison withdrawal with full honors, civilian choice between leaving safely or remaining under guaranteed religious freedom and property protection, and promises of fair Ottoman governance. These offers, proclaimed publicly and repeated regularly, aimed to create doubt among defenders about whether the suffering and danger of continued resistance serve any purpose when honorable capitulation remained available. Byzantine authorities countered with proclamations emphasizing Nicomedia's historical significance and sacred duty to resist Muslim conquest, organized religious processions calling for divine intervention, and circulated reports, some accurate, others wishful thinking, of massive relief expeditions being prepared in Constantinople. The battle for Nicomedia's fate would be fought simultaneously on walls, at sea, and in the minds of exhausted defenders questioning whether their sacrifices would ultimately prove meaningful or merely postpone the inevitable. Summer 1337 witnessed the conflict around Nicomedia evolving into a complex naval campaign that tested Ottoman maritime capabilities to their absolute limits while revealing both potential and constraints of the fleet Orhan had painstakingly assembled over 6 years of determined effort. The Gulf of Midson became a contested waterway, where Byzantine and Ottoman vessels engaged in a deadly game of maneuver and countermaneuver, with neither side able to establish decisive control, but both inflicting sufficient damage to prevent their opponent from operating with impunity. Byzantine warships, crewed by sailors whose families had served in imperial fleets for generations and commanded by officers trained in naval tactics refined over centuries, possessed enormous advantages in seamanship, tactical sophistication, and sheer experience. Yet the Ottoman fleet, though crude and often outmaneuvered in direct engagements, compensated through numbers, determination, and willingness to accept casualties that more cautious Byzantine commanders sought to avoid. This maritime stalemate created precisely the conditions Orhan desired. Nicomedia could still receive some supplies, preventing the desperate starvation that might trigger relief efforts or European intervention, but not enough to sustain the population and garrison indefinitely without gradual deterioration of their position. The evolution of Ottoman naval tactics during the Nicomedia campaign revealed a remarkable capacity for adaptation and learning that would characterize Ottoman military development for centuries. After initial engagements where Byzantine superior seamanship led to humiliating Ottoman defeats, Turkish commanders began avoiding direct naval battles and instead employing guerrilla tactics better suited to their capabilities, ambushing isolated Byzantine vessels, using smaller, more maneuverable boats that could exploit coastal shallows where larger Byzantine warships couldn't safely navigate, conducting night attacks when visibility limitations reduced Byzantine tactical advantages, and most effectively, establishing shore batteries with newly acquired artillery that could harass Byzantine vessels approaching Nicomedia without risking Ottoman ships in open combat. These improvised tactics, born from necessity and refined through painful experience, proved surprisingly effective at constricting Byzantine maritime operations even without achieving decisive naval victories. According to historical analysis by scholars such as Colin Imber, whose comprehensive studies of early Ottoman military development document this transformative period, the naval lessons learned during the Nicomedia campaign would inform Ottoman maritime strategy for generations, and ultimately enable the creation of the formidable Ottoman navy that would dominate the Mediterranean in subsequent centuries. Inside Nicomedia, The gradual constriction of supplies during the campaign's second and third months created mounting anxiety, even though the situation had not yet deteriorated into a genuine crisis. Food prices increased steadily as merchants recognized that supply convoys were arriving less frequently and in smaller quantities than required to sustain the population indefinitely. Governor Constantine implemented rationing measures attempting to ensure fair distribution and prevent hoarding, but enforcement proved difficult when wealthy citizens could bribe corrupt officials or hide supplies in private storerooms. The garrison consumed disproportionate shares of available food, justified by military necessity but creating resentment among civilians watching their children receive reduced rations while soldiers ate adequately. More subtly, but perhaps more consequentially, the psychological impact of semi-isolation began affecting morale as defenders recognized that each passing week without decisive Byzantine relief efforts suggested the empire was once again abandoning an Anatolian city to its fate. The memory of Bursa and Nicaea, both of which had held out for years, expecting relief that never came in sufficient strength, haunted Nicomedias' defenders and undermined confidence that their suffering would ultimately prove worthwhile. Emperor Andronikos III faced an agonizing dilemma remarkably similar to those that had paralyzed Byzantine response during previous Ottoman sieges. Committing substantial naval and military forces to relieve Nicomedia risked catastrophic defeat if Ottoman forces proved stronger than expected. Yet allowing the city to fall would complete Byzantine expulsion from Anatolia and potentially trigger wholesale collapse of remaining imperial territories. The emperor's response revealed both genuine effort and persistent limitations that characterized Byzantine governance in this declining period. He assembled a significant relief fleet, reportedly numbering over 100 vessels carrying supplies and several thousand soldiers, and dispatched it toward Nicomedia with orders to break the Ottoman blockade and deliver sufficient provisions to enable prolonged resistance. This represented the most substantial Byzantine military effort in response to Ottoman expansion in over a decade, suggesting Andronikos recognized Nicomedia's critical importance and was willing to commit meaningful resources to its defense. Yet the relief expedition's execution revealed the same operational and organizational deficiencies that had plagued Byzantine military efforts throughout the era. Delays in assembling and provisioning the fleet, divided command authority that hindered coordinated action, and insufficient intelligence about Ottoman capabilities and dispositions. The naval battle that erupted in late July 1337 when the Byzantine relief fleet attempted to break through to Nicomedia proved to be one of the most significant maritime engagements in early Ottoman history, though its tactical details remain frustratingly vague in surviving chronicles. The Byzantine fleet, vastly superior in numbers and naval professionalism, should have easily swept aside Ottoman vessels and delivered its relief supplies to the besieged city. Instead, the engagement devolved into confused fighting where Byzantine advantages in open-water naval tactics proved less decisive than expected given the confined waters of the Gulf, the proximity to shore where Ottoman land forces could influence the battle, and what Byzantine sources described as unprecedented Turkish determination and willingness to accept catastrophic casualties. Ottoman vessels employed ramming and boarding tactics that negated Byzantine advantages in sailing and maneuver, essentially transforming naval combat into the close-quarters fighting where Turkish warriors excelled. Several Byzantine ships were captured or sunk, though Ottoman losses were proportionally far higher, and most critically, the relief fleet failed to reach Nicomedia with its cargo intact, achieving only a partial delivery of supplies before withdrawing to avoid further losses. The battle's outcome was neither a decisive Ottoman victory nor a complete Byzantine success, but rather an inconclusive engagement that left both sides claiming triumph while privately recognizing limitations. Nonetheless represented a strategic turning point that fundamentally altered the siege's dynamics. The Byzantine Empire had assembled and committed its most substantial relief effort in response to Ottoman expansion, yet had achieved only limited success despite vast advantages in resources and naval expertise. This failure demonstrated that even when Byzantium made genuine efforts to defend its territories, systemic weaknesses in organization, command, and execution prevented effective action. For the Ottomans, the battle proved they could contest Byzantine naval supremacy in confined waters even if unable to dominate open seas, and more importantly, that Byzantine relief efforts could be resisted successfully with sufficient determination. Inside Nicomedia, the relief fleet's failure to deliver adequate supplies devastated morale, perhaps more severely than if no relief attempt had been made, as defenders recognized that even when the empire tried to help, its assistance proved inadequate. The psychological impact of this near-miss relief, so close to salvation yet ultimately insufficient, would poison morale more effectively than Ottoman military pressure ever could. Autumn 1337 descended upon Nicomedia, with the city entering the siege's 6th month in deteriorating condition, yet still far from the desperate starvation that had forced Bursa's surrender after years of blockade. The partial success of the Byzantine relief fleet in delivering some supplies meant the garrison and population were uncomfortable, but not yet dying en masse from famine, creating strategic ambiguity about whether continued resistance remained viable or whether surrender negotiations should begin while defenders still possessed bargaining leverage. Governor Constantine struggled to maintain unity among increasingly fractious constituencies within the besieged city. Military officers who generally favored continued resistance out of professional pride and belief in their oath to defend imperial territory. Aristocratic families who had most to lose from Ottoman conquests but also possessed resources enabling them to endure hardship longer than common citizens. Merchant guilds calculating whether Ottoman or Byzantine rule would prove more profitable for their commercial interests. And common laborers and craftsmen whose families suffered most severely from reduced rations, and who consequently proved most receptive to Ottoman surrender offers, promising fair treatment and religious freedom. The diplomatic maneuvering during this crucial period revealed both sides attempting to influence Nicomedia's fate through negotiations and political pressure alongside military operations. Orhan sent increasingly generous surrender offers into the city, now explicitly promising that all citizens who remained would pay lower taxes under Ottoman governance than they had paid to Byzantine authorities, that Orthodox bishops would retain their ecclesiastical positions and property, and that Nicomedia would become a major Ottoman administrative center, bringing prestige and economic opportunity. These offers, which exceeded the already generous terms offered during previous sieges, reflected both Orhan's recognition that Nicomedia's symbolic importance warranted special inducements in his sophisticated understanding that populations surrender when convinced that capitulation serves their interests better than continued resistance. Byzantine authorities countered with increasingly desperate propaganda emphasizing religious duty to resist Muslim conquest, warning of forced conversions and persecution that Ottoman tolerance policies had consistently disproven, and circulating unsubstantiated rumors of massive new relief expeditions being prepared. The contest for Nicomedia's loyalty occurred as much through competing narratives and promises as through military pressure on the walls. Emperor Andronicos III's position during autumn 1337 combined genuine desire to save Nicomedia with political constraints that severely limited his options for effective action. The summer's naval battle had exhausted Byzantine military resources available for relief operations, as assembling another major fleet would require time and money the empire lacked. Domestic political challenges demanded imperial attention, with aristocratic factions in Constantinople maneuvering against each other and occasionally against the emperor himself, diverting focus from external threats. Most significantly, Andronicos faced the brutal calculus that Byzantine emperors had confronted for centuries. The empire's territories were too extensive and enemies too numerous for the available resources to defend everywhere effectively, forcing agonizing choices about which regions to prioritize and which to essentially abandon. The emperor's policy toward Nicomedia during this period suggested he had essentially accepted that the city would fall, but sought to delay that outcome as long as possible while positioning himself, politically, to avoid blame for the loss. The human suffering inside Nicomedia during the siege's middle phase, though not yet catastrophic, nonetheless imposed significant hardships that gradually eroded the population's will to resist. Food scarcity meant most citizens existed on reduced rations that left them constantly hungry, though not yet starving, a chronic discomfort that wore down morale more insidiously than dramatic famine might have. The wealthy could still obtain adequate food through inflated black market prices, creating visible class divisions that generated resentment and undermined social cohesion. Disease spread through crowded quarters as malnutrition weakened immune systems, though the situation had not yet deteriorated into the epidemic pestilence that had devastated other besieged cities. Families faced agonizing decisions about whether to attempt dangerous escapes through Ottoman lines or remain in an increasingly precarious city. The garrison, though still capable of defending walls, suffered from exhaustion due to constant vigilance requirements, periodic casualties from Ottoman raids, and growing uncertainty about their ultimate fate. This grinding attrition of health, morale, and hope proved more psychologically devastating than dramatic military assaults, as defenders recognized that their situation would only deteriorate further with each passing week. The economic warfare Orhan waged against Nicomedia demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how cities depend on complex commercial networks that siege conditions inevitably disrupt with cascading consequences. Ottoman forces systematically destroyed or occupied every town and village in Nicomedia's hinterland, eliminating any possibility of receiving food or supplies from traditional agricultural sources. Turkish cavalry patrolled constantly along all overland routes, making any attempt to smuggle supplies into the city extraordinarily dangerous. The partial naval blockade, though not complete, sufficiently disrupted maritime commerce to strangle Nicomedia's economy even when preventing absolute starvation. The city's artisans, unable to obtain raw materials for their crafts and lacking customers with money to purchase finished goods, faced unemployment and destitution. Merchants watched their accumulated wealth become worthless as commercial activity ceased and inflation destroyed the value of Byzantine currency. This systematic economic destruction undermined Nicomedia's viability as an urban center, independent of immediate military considerations, ensuring that even if the city somehow maintained its defenses, its economic foundations were being permanently damaged. The military situation during autumn 1337 showed Ottoman forces maintaining steady pressure while avoiding costly assault attempts that might squander their advantages. Orhan ordered regular probing attacks against Nicomedia's walls, primarily to keep defenders constantly alert and prevent any relaxation of vigilance, but never committed substantial forces to breaches that Byzantine soldiers could still effectively defend. He intensified the naval blockade as his sailors gained experience and confidence, gradually constricting maritime access though never achieving complete control. He constructed siege works and artillery positions that demonstrated Ottoman entrenchment and permanence, psychological messages suggesting the Turks would never withdraw regardless of how long resistance continued. Most effectively, he ensured that every deserter or refugee who escaped Nicomedia reported generous treatment and Ottoman promises being honored, creating an incentive for others to surrender or flee rather than endure continued hardship for a Byzantine Empire that seemed increasingly unlikely to provide effective assistance. This patient, multidimensional approach reflected Orhan's maturity as a strategic thinker who understood that capturing Nicomedia mattered less than capturing it efficiently without excessive casualties or costs that might undermine future operations. Winter 1337 brought intensified hardship to besieged Nicomedia as cold weather compounded the difficulties of siege conditions, creating a perfect storm of privation that finally began breaking the population's will to resist after nearly 9 months of defiant endurance. The reduced food supplies that had been uncomfortable but manageable during warmer months became genuinely inadequate when combined with cold weather's increased caloric demands and the difficulty of heated outlets and fuel supplies had been exhausted. Byzantine naval operations that had maintained partial supply access during the summer became significantly more difficult and dangerous as winter storms swept the Sea of Marmara, reducing the frequency of supply deliveries precisely when they were most desperately needed. Disease, which had spread gradually during previous months, accelerated dramatically as weakened immune systems, inadequate nutrition, cold exposure, and deteriorating sanitation created ideal conditions for epidemic illnesses. The death rate among Nicomedia's population, which had been elevated but not catastrophic through autumn, began climbing steeply as the elderly, very young, and those already weakened by illness succumbed to conditions that healthier bodies might have survived. The political fracturing within Nicomedia during this desperate winter revealed how siege conditions could dissolve social cohesion and pit different groups against each other in struggles over scarce resources and competing visions of survival strategy. Governor Constantine attempted to maintain unified resistance, but his authority eroded as various factions pursued their own agendas. Military officers, recognizing that the garrison's capability to defend walls was deteriorating as soldiers weakened from malnutrition and disease, privately discussed surrender negotiations while publicly proclaiming continued commitment to resistance. Aristocratic families, possessing resources that enabled them to endure longer than common citizens, split between those advocating negotiated surrender while they still had bargaining leverage, and hardliners insisting on resistance until Byzantine relief arrived. The Orthodox Church hierarchy faced its own internal divisions between bishops who framed surrender as an unforgivable betrayal of Christianity and pragmatic clergy who argued that preserving Christian lives took precedence over maintaining Byzantine political control. Common citizens, suffering most severely and possessing the least say in official decisions, increasingly expressed their desperation through rising crime, occasional riots over food distribution, and growing numbers attempting dangerous escapes through Ottoman lines. The secret diplomatic contacts between various Nicomedian factions and Ottoman representatives during winter 1337 demonstrated how Orhan's reputation for honorable dealing and generous surrender terms had created incentives for negotiation even before military defeat became inevitable. Different groups within the city, each pursuing their own interests, opened back-channel communications exploring what Ottoman rule might mean for their particular constituencies. Aristocratic families sought assurances about property rights and social status under the new regime. Merchant guilds negotiated potential commercial arrangements and tax rates. Orthodox bishops requested detailed guarantees about religious freedom and ecclesiastical authority. Even some military officers, recognizing that their professional skills would remain valuable under any government, quietly explored whether Ottoman service might offer opportunities. These fragmented negotiations, conducted without central coordination and often in mutual ignorance of each other's efforts, prevented any unified bargaining position but collectively signaled that Nicomedia's will to resist had fractured beyond repair. Orhan, receiving these various approaches, recognized that the city was effectively negotiating its own surrender despite Governor Constantine's official continued defiance. Emperor Andronikos III's response to Nicomedia's deteriorating situation during winter 1337 revealed the Byzantine Empire's fundamental incapacity to defend its remaining territories regardless of their strategic importance or symbolic significance. The emperor, receiving desperate appeals from Governor Constantine describing the garrison's declining condition and pleading for immediate relief, could offer only encouraging messages and vague promises of future assistance that everyone recognized were meaningless. Byzantine naval operations to supply Nicomedia, already dangerous during summer, became prohibitively risky during winter storms, resulting in several supply ships being lost with their cargoes and crews. The empire's treasury, depleted by decades of civil wars and endless military emergencies, lacked funds to equip and provision another major relief expedition even if military forces could be assembled. Most devastatingly, Andronikos faced the reality that even if he somehow managed to temporarily relieve Nicomedia, the Ottomans would simply resume the siege after Byzantine forces withdrew, creating an endless cycle where the empire exhausted itself, maintaining garrisons that could never be decisively secured. The emperor's policy toward Nicomedia during this period essentially consisted of hoping the city could somehow hold out until circumstances changed, a strategy that substituted wishful thinking for genuine military planning. The human cost of Nicomedia's siege reached its peak during that terrible winter when the cumulative effects of malnutrition, disease, cold, and despair created the humanitarian catastrophe within the city walls. Chroniclers writing after the siege, drawing on survivor testimony, described scenes of almost unimaginable suffering, children dying of starvation while their parents lacked strength to bury them properly, elderly citizens simply lying down to die when their bodies could no longer sustain basic function, disease spreading unchecked due to populations too weak to maintain basic hygiene, and occasional instances of violence as desperate people fought over scraps of food or fuel. The social fabric that had sustained urban civilization for over a millennium disintegrated under the crushing weight, revealing how quickly humans revert to survival desperation when basic needs cannot be met. The garrison, though maintaining military discipline better than the civilian population, nonetheless deteriorated severely as soldiers weakened from inadequate rations and disease. By early 1338, perhaps a third of Nicomedia's original population had died from starvation, disease, or siege-related violence, a catastrophic mortality rate that made continued resistance both militarily impossible and morally indefensible. The breaking point came in February 1338, when a delegation of Nicomedia's leading citizens, acting without Governor Constantine's authorization and representing a coalition of aristocrats, merchants, clergy, and even some military officers, approached Ottoman lines under a flag of truce, requesting formal surrender negotiations. This dramatic step, which technically constituted treason against Byzantine authority, reflected widespread recognition that continued resistance would only result in more death without achieving any strategic purpose. Governor Constantine, confronted with this fait accompli and recognizing that he could no longer count on garrison support for continued resistance, reluctantly agreed to participate in formal surrender talks rather than face the humiliation of being bypassed entirely by civilian authorities. The psychology of this moment revealed siege warfare's ultimate reality. Defenders surrender not when walls are breached, but when collective will to resist collapses. When the suffering of continued defiance exceeds any conceivable benefit, and when survival takes precedence over abstract loyalties. Nicomedia had reached that point after 9 months of siege that had transformed a prosperous Byzantine city into a charnel house where the living barely outnumbered the dead. March 1338 witnessed the formal surrender negotiations between Nicomedia's representatives and Ottoman officials. complex diplomatic proceedings that would determine not just the immediate terms of capitulation, but also set precedents for how the Ottomans would govern their most significant Anatolian conquest and how remaining Byzantine territories might eventually be absorbed. The negotiations took place in a tent erected between the siege lines, neutral ground where representatives could meet without either side appearing to humble themselves by entering enemy territory. The Byzantine delegation included Governor Constantine, several aristocratic family heads, Orthodox bishops, and merchant guild leaders, a diverse group reflecting the fragmented nature of authority within the besieged city. The Ottoman delegation was led by Orhan himself, a significant gesture demonstrating the Sultan's recognition of Nicomedias' importance, accompanied by his most trusted advisors, including both Muslim jurists who could address religious questions and Christian administrators from previously conquered territories who could provide reassurance about Ottoman governance practices. The surrender terms that emerged from several days of intense negotiations reflected both Ottoman strength and Orhan's sophisticated political instincts about how generous treatment of defeated enemies served long-term strategic interests better than harsh conquest. The garrison would be permitted to withdraw to Constantinople with full military honors, weapons, and personal property terms that preserved Byzantine soldiers' dignity while removing them as a military threat. Civilians could choose between leaving for Byzantine territory with safe passage and protected property rights, or remaining in Nicomedia under Ottoman rule with guaranteed religious freedom, property protection, and promises that no forced conversions would occur. Orthodox churches would remain Christian places of worship except for the main cathedral, which would become the city's Friday mosque, a symbolic assertion of Islamic dominance but restrained compared to a conquerors typically imposed. Significantly for Nicomedia's elite, Ottoman authorities promised to recognize existing property arrangements, maintain commercial privileges, and even employ Byzantine aristocrats and administrators in Ottoman provincial governance if they possessed useful expertise and demonstrated loyalty. These terms, similar in general outline to those offered at Bursa and Nicaea, but even more generous in specific details, reflected Orhan's understanding that Nicomedia's symbolic importance warranted extraordinary measures to ensure smooth transition and minimize resistance. The debate within Nicomedia over whether to accept these surrender terms, though brief given the desperate circumstances, nonetheless revealed continuing divisions about whether capitulation constituted pragmatic realism or unforgivable betrayal. Hardline Byzantine loyalists, primarily religious conservatives and a minority of aristocrats with strong emotional attachments to the empire, argued passionately that surrendering Nicomedia, the last major Byzantine city in Asia, represented abandonment of 13 centuries of Roman Christian governance and betrayal of martyrs who had died defending the faith against Islam. They proclaimed that God would judge Nicomedia's population harshly for choosing survival over religious duty, and that accepting Muslim rule would condemn future generations to Islamic domination. The pragmatic majority, however, pointed out the undeniable reality that continued resistance would only cause more death without changing the outcome. That Byzantine relief was not coming, regardless of how long they suffered, and that Ottoman surrender terms offered better treatment and more security than Byzantine administration had provided in recent decades. Governor Constantine, recognizing that the overwhelming majority sentiment favored acceptance, formally agreed to the surrender terms while privately recording his protest to preserve his personal honor and reputation. The actual transfer of power occurred on March 17, 1338, in carefully choreographed ceremonies designed to honor both sides while marking the definitive end of Byzantine rule and beginning of Ottoman governance. The Byzantine garrison marched out of Nicomedia's gates in full military formation, banners flying and drums beating a slow march that announced withdrawal rather than defeat. Passing between lines of Ottoman soldiers, standing at attention in a gesture of respect that Orhan had learned from previous sieges, generated goodwill far exceeding its minimal cost. Thousands of civilians followed the garrison, carrying whatever belongings they could transport, heading toward Byzantine ships that would carry them to Constantinople or other imperial territories. Yet significantly, perhaps half of Nicomedia's surviving population estimate suggests 15,000 people, a dramatic reduction from the pre-siege population due to deaths from starvation and disease, who chose to remain under Ottoman protection, their decision reflecting both exhaustion from the siege and calculation that Ottoman rule might offer better prospects than refugee status in Byzantine territories. Once the departing garrison and refugees had cleared the city, Orhan entered Nicomedia through the main gate, accompanied by his sons Suleiman and Murad, religious scholars, and administrative officials who would establish Ottoman governance. The immediate aftermath of Nicomedia's capture revealed Orhan implementing a sophisticated occupation policy that combines symbolic assertions of Ottoman authority with pragmatic measures designed to restore the devastated city's functionality and convince the remaining population that they had made the right choice in staying. He established his residence in the former Byzantine governor's palace, symbolically claiming authority while also demonstrating that Nicomedia would become an important Ottoman administrative center rather than merely conquered territory to be plundered. He appointed capable administrators drawn from both Turkish Muslims and local Greek Christians who had remained, creating a hybrid governing structure that could implement Ottoman policies while drawing on local knowledge and expertise. Most urgently, he ordered the immediate distribution of food supplies from Ottoman stores to prevent further starvation deaths, a humanitarian gesture that also served the practical purpose of demonstrating that Ottoman rule meant security and sustenance rather than exploitation. According to historical documentation preserved in Ottoman administrative records and analyzed by scholars such as Halidni, whose comprehensive studies of early Ottoman governance provide detailed evidence of these policies. The transition in Nicomedia established administrative precedents and procedures that would be replicated in virtually every subsequent Ottoman conquest. The religious transition in Nicomedia, like the political transfer, combined symbolic assertions of Islamic dominance with practical tolerance that reflected Ottoman pragmatism about governing diverse populations. The main cathedral was formally converted to a grand mosque in a ceremony attended by Muslim religious scholars, Ottoman officials, and, significantly, some Christian bishops who had remained in the city, their presence symbolizing acceptance of the new order. Yet Orhan personally issued a decree guaranteeing protection for all other churches, specifically prohibiting forced conversion, and warning that any Muslim who harassed or persecuted Christians would face severe punishment. He met with Orthodox bishops to assure them their ecclesiastical authority would be recognized and their properties protected, creating a millet system where Christian communities would maintain internal autonomy under religious leadership while accepting Muslim political supremacy. This carefully balanced approach, publicly emphasizing Islamic identity while privately demonstrating religious tolerance, would become characteristic of Ottoman governance and enable the empire to rule vast territories with diverse religious populations for centuries. The policy reflected Orhan's sophisticated understanding that coercion breeds resistance, while tolerance, though ideologically impure, proved more effective for maintaining stable governance over heterogeneous populations. The fall of Nicomedia in March 1338 represented a watershed moment in Eastern Mediterranean geopolitics, completing the Byzantine Empire's expulsion from Anatolia after 13 centuries of Roman rule and establishing Ottoman dominance around the entire Sea of Marmara coastline, with consequences that would shape regional power dynamics for the next 6 centuries. The symbolic significance of losing the last major Byzantine city in Asia Minor proved as devastating to imperial morale as the immediate strategic implications, triggering widespread recognition throughout the Byzantine world that the empire had permanently lost its Anatolian heartland and would henceforth be confined to Constantinople, Thrace, and scattered European territories. Emperor Andronikos III, receiving news of Nicomedia's surrender, reportedly expressed profound despair and spent days in religious seclusion, recognizing that his reign would be forever associated with the definitive loss of Asia. Byzantine aristocrats who had maintained estates in Anatolia for generations fled en masse to Constantinople, creating a refugee crisis that strained the capital's resources while bringing traumatic first-hand testimony about Ottoman power that demoralized the population and undermined confidence in imperial governance. The Ottoman strategic position after Nicomedia's capture was dramatically stronger than even optimistic observers might have predicted a decade earlier, when Orhan began his systematic expansion to northwestern Anatolia. He now controlled all major cities from Bursa to Nicomedia, a vast territory encompassing perhaps 50,000 square miles and several 100,000 subjects, with direct access to the Sea of Marmara coastline that enabled maritime trade and opened possibilities for naval projection. His treasury, funded by taxation of these productive urban centers and their rich agricultural hinterlands, generated revenues rivaling or exceeding those of many established regional powers. His military forces, battle-tested through a decade of successful sieges and now numbering perhaps 25,000 warriors plus reserves, could operate simultaneously on multiple fronts without exhausting resources. Perhaps most significantly, Ottoman administrative institutions had evolved during this expansion from improvised tribal arrangements into sophisticated governing structures capable of managing ethnically and religiously diverse urban populations across extensive territories, the foundation for future imperial administration that would govern 3 continents. according to scholarly analysis by historians such as Colin Imber and Simil Kafadar, whose comprehensive studies of Ottoman expansion document this transformative period. Nicomedias' conquest marked the point where the Ottomans transitioned from being a successful regional power to becoming a potential empire with realistic prospects for far greater expansion. The Byzantine strategic options after losing Nicomedia were uniformly grim, reflecting an empire that had been in decline for 3 centuries, but now faced an existential crisis requiring dramatic decisions about priorities and survival strategies. Emperor Andronikos and his advisors recognized that reconquering lost Anatolian territories was beyond Byzantine military capacity, given the empire's limited resources and multiple threats. The empire's focus shifted definitively toward defending remaining European territories, particularly Constantinople itself, Thrace, and possessions in Greece and the Balkans. Byzantine diplomatic efforts concentrated on seeking European assistance through appeals to Christian solidarity against Muslim expansion, with limited success given European powers' preoccupation with their own conflicts and the 100 Years' War between England and France. Some Byzantine strategists advocated for negotiating long-term accommodation with the Ottomans, essentially accepting territorial losses in exchange for peace treaties that might preserve what remained, though such proposals generated intense controversy given the theological and political implications of formally recognizing Muslim Turkish authority over formerly Christian lands. The empire's paralysis in formulating a coherent response to Ottoman expansion would characterize Byzantine policy for the remaining century until Constantinople's final fall in 1453. The reaction among other Turkish beyliks in Anatolia to Ottoman success at capturing Nicomedia combined respect for Orhan's achievement with growing anxiety about Ottoman power potentially threatening their own independence. Some Turkish leaders, particularly those governing principalities adjacent to Ottoman territories, recognized that Orhan's expanding state posed potential existential threats and began exploring defensive alliances with Byzantine's Venetians or other powers that might counterbalance Ottoman strength. The Karaman Beylik in central Anatolia, which had previously been considered the most powerful Turkish principality, now found itself rivaled or exceeded by Ottoman capabilities, triggering strategic competition that would persist for generations. Other Turkish rulers, especially younger and ambitious leaders seeking opportunities for advancement, increasingly sought to enter Ottoman service rather than competing independently, offering their allegiance and military forces in exchange for positions within the Ottoman system. This dynamic, where Ottoman success simultaneously threatened rival Turkish leaders while attracting those willing to subordinate themselves, accelerated the consolidation of Anatolian Turkish principalities under Ottoman hegemony that would be largely complete within another generation. The pattern established after Nicomedia's fall, where the strongest Turkish power gradually absorbed or subordinated rivals through a combination of conquest and voluntary submission, transformed the fragmented Anatolian political landscape into an increasingly unified Ottoman domain. The broader Islamic world's response to Ottoman achievements enhanced Orhan's legitimacy and positioned the Ottomans as champions of Islam whose expansion represented religiously sanctioned jihad, rather than mere worldly power-seeking. The Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and Syria, which functioned as the de facto leader of Sunni Islam after the Mongol destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate, sent congratulatory embassies recognizing Ottoman successes and implicitly acknowledging the dynasty's Islamic credentials. Religious scholars from across the Muslim world gravitated toward Ottoman territories, establishing madrasas and Sufi lodges that provided intellectual and spiritual infrastructure, strengthening Ottoman claims to religious legitimacy. The framing of Ottoman expansion as jihad against Christian infidels, though certainly involving worldly motivations of conquest and plunder, nonetheless carried genuine religious significance for warriors who understood their campaigns as fulfilling religious obligations, and for populations who saw Ottoman governance as establishing proper Islamic rule over territories that had been wrongly held by Christians. This religious legitimacy would prove crucial for the Ottoman ability to mobilize resources and maintain morale during subsequent centuries of expansion and conflict. The European Christian response to Nicomedia's fall and the broader pattern of Ottoman expansion revealed the gap between rhetorical outrage and practical willingness to provide meaningful assistance. Pope Benedict XII issued passionate statements decrying Muslim conquest of historically Christian territories and calling for a new crusade to recover lost lands. But these papal proclamations generated minimal concrete action, given Europe's preoccupation with the 100 Years' War, conflicts in Italy, and various local disputes. Venice and Genoa, the major Italian maritime republics with substantial commercial interests in Byzantine territories, expressed concern about Ottoman expansion, primarily through the lens of how it might affect their trading privileges, and ultimately proved more interested in negotiating favorable commercial arrangements with the Ottomans than in organizing military opposition. The Kingdom of Hungary, geographically closest to Ottoman expansion and theoretically most threatened, was consumed by internal political struggles and conflicts with neighboring powers. This European indifference to Byzantine pleas for assistance demonstrated that appeals to Christian solidarity meant little when individual European powers prioritized their particular interests, a pattern that would persist through the remainder of Byzantine history and enable Ottoman expansion to continue largely unopposed by coordinated European resistance. The long-term consequences of Nicomedias' capture for the demographic and cultural transformation of Anatolia from predominantly Christian Greek to predominantly Muslim Turkish land became clear only over subsequent generations, but were set in motion by the patterns established during this period. Ottoman policies encouraging Turkish settlement in conquered cities, while protecting but not privileging the Christian populations, created gradual demographic shifts that would eventually produce Muslim majorities. Economic opportunities and social advantages associated with conversion to Islam generated a steady flow of Christians adopting the Muslim faith over generations, a process that was never forced but was powerfully incentivized by Ottoman administrative and legal structures. The arrival of Turkish colonists, Islamic religious institutions, and Ottoman administrative culture gradually transformed the linguistic, religious, and cultural character of cities that had been Greek Christian for over a millennium. This transformation, which scholars have documented through careful analysis of demographic records, tax registers, and contemporary accounts, represented one of history's most significant cultural and religious transitions, comparable in scope to the earlier Christianization of the Roman Empire or the Islamic conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries. Nicomedias' capture by completing Ottoman control of northwestern Anatolia's major urban centers accelerated this transformation by bringing Turkish Muslim governance, settlement, and cultural influence to the region's last major Byzantine stronghold. The capture of Nicomedia represented the crowning achievement of Sultan Orhan's 26-year reign up to that point, validating the strategic vision and patient state-building that had transformed a minor frontier principality into the dominant power in northwestern Anatolia with realistic prospects for far greater expansion. The 50-year-old Sultan, reflecting on the journey from his inheritance of a struggling tribal confederation in 1312 to his governance of a sophisticated state spanning tens of thousands of square miles with hundreds of thousands of subjects, could take satisfaction having accomplished far more than anyone might have reasonably predicted. He had proven that Turkish warriors could capture and govern major fortified cities, not merely conduct hit-and-run raids. He had demonstrated that Muslim rulers could govern diverse populations, including substantial Christian minorities, through tolerance and competent administration rather than coercion and persecution. He had built administrative institutions, military organizations, and governing practices that would outlast him and enable his successors to continue expansion. Most importantly, he had established the Ottoman dynasty's reputation for military effectiveness, honorable dealing, and capable governance, intangible assets that would prove as valuable as any territorial conquest. The administrative consolidation Orhan implemented in Nicomedia during the months following its capture established patterns and precedents that would characterize Ottoman provincial governance for centuries. He conducted comprehensive surveys documenting property ownership, agricultural productivity, and tax obligations throughout the city and its hinterland, creating detailed registers that would form the basis for the Timar system's expansion into this region. He established courts where qadis trained in Islamic law would adjudicate disputes, alongside recognition of Christian bishops' authority over their community's internal religious matters, creating the dual legal system that would accommodate Ottoman religious pluralism. He appointed governors and administrators selected for competence and loyalty rather than purely tribal or familial connections, building a merit-based bureaucracy that could function effectively regardless of individual personalities. He commissioned major building projects, mosques, madrasas, bathhouses, caravanserais, and markets that would physically transform Nicomedia's urban landscape while providing employment and demonstrating Ottoman commitment to the city's prosperity. These unglamorous administrative tasks, though far less dramatic than military conquest, proved essential for transforming conquered territories into integral parts of a functioning state. The economic revival of Nicomedia under early Ottoman rule demonstrated how effective governance could restore prosperity to regions devastated by warfare, providing tangible benefits that helped reconcile conquered populations to new rulers and validated Ottoman claims about superior governance. Orhan implemented commercial policies designed to attract merchants and stimulate trade, significantly lower taxes than Byzantine authorities had imposed, standardized regulations preventing fraud and monopolistic practices, protection for caravans and travelers regardless of religious affiliation, and even-handed justice in commercial disputes. The city's strategic location at the junction of land and sea routes, combined with Ottoman control of surrounding territories ensuring security, made Nicomedia an attractive commercial hub within months of the conquest. Armenian, Jewish, Greek, and even Italian merchants found Ottoman Nicomedias markets profitable and secure, bringing commercial networks that connected the city to trade routes spanning from Venice to Persia. According to economic records analyzed by historians such as Tevke Pamuk, whose quantitative studies of Ottoman economic development document this transformation, Nicomedia's commercial revenues under Ottoman administration within 5 years exceeded those from the late Byzantine period, demonstrating that effective governance and security could generate prosperity that benefited both rulers and subjects. The military implications of controlling Nicomedia, combined with previously captured Bursa and Nicaea, positioned the Ottomans to potentially cross into Europe or expand in multiple directions as strategic opportunities arose. The three major cities formed a triangle controlling northwestern Anatolia's most productive territories, connected by secure roads and capable of supporting and supplying large military forces. Ottoman control of the entire Sea of Marmara's southern coastline meant Byzantine Constantinople was now surrounded on its Asian side by Turkish territories, a strategic encirclement that would prove psychologically devastating to Byzantine morale. The naval capabilities Orhan had developed during the Nicomedia campaign, though still modest compared to established maritime powers, provided a foundation for future Ottoman naval expansion that would eventually dominate eastern Mediterranean waters. Most significantly, Ottoman forces were now positioned adjacent to the Dardanelles Strait, separating Asia from Europe, opening possibilities for expansion into the Balkans that would transform a regional Anatolian power into a world historical empire spanning 3 continents. The personal cost of these achievements for Orhan himself, though rarely documented in chronicles focused on military and political events, must have been substantial given the decades of constant warfare, political maneuvering, and administrative burden that empire building required. The Sultan had spent more than half his life conducting military campaigns, negotiating with allies and enemies, managing fractious subordinates, making life-and-death decisions affecting thousands, and bearing responsibility for an expanding state's governance. He had lost his eldest and most capable son, Suleiman, in a riding accident just months before Nicomedia's capture, a personal tragedy that devastated him emotionally while raising succession questions about whether his surviving son, Murad, would prove equally capable. The psychological burden of ordering sieges that would inevitably cause starvation and death among civilian populations, even when those sieges served strategic purposes, must have weighed on any leader possessing normal human empathy. The constant vigilance required to maintain authority among ambitious subordinates, detect potential betrayals, and navigate complex political relationships would have been mentally and emotionally exhausting. Yet Orhan endured these burdens and continued functioning effectively for another 24 years until his death in 1362, demonstrating the extraordinary personal qualities required for successful empire building. The historical assessment of Orhan's achievements through capturing Nicomedia must recognize him as one of the most consequential state builders in medieval history, though he would never become as famous as his more dramatic successors like Mehmed II, who conquered Constantinople. Osman, Orhan's father, founded the dynasty and carved out initial territories, but Orhan transformed that modest principality into a functioning state capable of unlimited expansion. He developed the administrative institutions, the Timar system, the dual legal framework, and the religious tolerance policies that would enable Ottoman governance of vast, multi-ethnic, multi-religious territories. He established military organizations combining Turkish cavalry traditions with professional infantry and developing naval capabilities that could operate on land and sea. He pioneered diplomatic and political strategies of patient siege warfare, generous surrender terms, and effective post-conquest governance that made Ottoman expansion remarkably efficient compared to other medieval conquerors. He created an Ottoman identity and governing culture that could integrate diverse populations into a shared political framework. All of these achievements, essential foundations for the Ottoman Empire that would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean for 6 centuries, were established during Orhan's reign and particularly during the decade of expansion from capturing Bursa in 1326 to capturing Nicomedia in 1338. The legacy of Nicomedia's capture and the broader Ottoman expansion that Orhan orchestrated extended far beyond the immediate political and military consequences. fundamentally altering the trajectory of Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, and eventually European history. The Ottoman Empire that emerged from these conquests would eventually control territories from Budapest to Baghdad, from Algeria to the Caucasus, governing perhaps 30 million subjects at its height and lasting until the 20th century. The administrative systems, military organizations, and cultural syntheses Orhan pioneered would be refined but not fundamentally altered by his successors, demonstrating the enduring value of institutions he created. The precedent of religious tolerance within Muslim political supremacy would make the Ottoman Empire a refuge for Jews expelled from Spain, dissenting Christians fleeing persecution elsewhere, and various heterodox Muslim sects, creating one of the medieval and early modern world's most cosmopolitan civilizations. Even the Ottoman Empire's eventual decline and collapse in the 20th century cannot erase the profound influence its rise exerted on global history, an influence that began in earnest when a patient, strategic Turkish sultan completed the conquest of Byzantine Anatolia by capturing Nicomedia in 1338, cutting Byzantine control and securing Ottoman dominance around the Sea of Marmara, thereby opening the path toward the conquest of Constantinople itself and the creation of one of history's great empires.